what do you want to see within that defence readiness bill when it does come forward?
So the Defence Readiness Bill is part of the articulation of how we return to a whole of society understanding about war in our time, that it's no longer something you just outsource to the uniformed military. So the first thing it must do is it must enable daily life to continue when the country is under assault, whether it's confrontation or conflict, above the threshold of military conflict, which is military stuff, and more than that, below the threshold. So it must be possible for the government to drive daily life in conditions of crisis where you can't allow everyone to make up their own mind whether they cooperate or not. The second thing is it must support mobilisation. It must enable the armed forces to go from a position at ease today, relatively speaking, onto a war footing where you're drawing in reserves, you're dispersing people, you're moving equipment and people to the continent, you're beginning to take casualties. And then it must endure, because if you look at the experience of Ukraine, which is year 5 now, and so this is not like sallying forth into Libya or even an Afghan campaign, which was neatly bounded. This is war where it could run for years. There's very likely mass casualties. There's very likely big damage to the built environment. And readiness and resilience is about endurance as much as getting started. So all of those things. That was once common, I think, during the Cold War. People understood that's how war was. It's completely evaporated, and now we're resurrecting it pretty much from scratch.
And lastly, I just want to touch on the suggestion that government has reached 1.5% of NATO, the target on resilience spending. In your view, is that investment sufficient or is more needed?
It needs to be spelled out. Yeah. We'd all like to know. The Prime Minister has made the bold statement that the 1.5% has actually been achieved. He uses other articulations to do with the 3.5%, which are not particularly convincing and led to John Healey's resignation. But the 1.5%, he confidently says, has already been met, but has not actually told us how it's been met. And I, among others, would be very interested to know precisely how. And maybe round the North Atlantic Council table tomorrow, he'll tell President Trump.
So from the perspective of defence infrastructure, it's clear what the money hasn't been spent on. It hasn't been spent on making places like Bryce Norton secure and effective, nor mending the military ports and expanding them yet. It hasn't been spent on gearing the NHS up to deal with mass casualties. It hasn't been spent on enabling mobilisation or forward-basing stock. So whatever the money has been spent on, it's hard to see in the military lane.
Thank you much. On to Emma Liu.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think you've both indicated that the DIP broadly implements the SDR recommendations, but that also there's important things missing from the DIP. So should a new Prime Minister and Cabinet relook at it or add to it and do a DIP Part 2?
Well, speaking as a politician, I think the new Prime Minister is going to have to look at the DIP again. Because whoever the new Prime Minister is, they're going to be confronted by allies in NATO, and especially by the American president, who is going to say, this is the letter that John Healey sent in resignation. So you, the new Secretary of State, you've got allegedly an extra 1.5 million, 0.02% more than John Healey got. What is this story about? Where is the plan that takes you to 3% to 3.5% by 9 years' time? I think we keep talking about 2035 as if it's a long distance away. The end of the decade is just 3.5 years to go, and 2035 is 9 years from now. So we're supposed to get to that point. And when you actually talk about the figures, to get to 3% would require an extra £21 billion a year on the defence budget, which is at the present moment 70 billion. To get to 3.5% requires 36 billion extra a year on the defence budget. So, you know, the assumption by NATO and by the Americans is that we're going to have to plot our way, plan our way towards that, and that is where the dip is unconvincing. And John Healey made it absolutely clear in his letter that it falls well short of what is required for defence and this country at a dangerous time, and that, you know, that letter will be widely circulated throughout the people who are attending the NATO summit in Ankara tomorrow.
So, as a citizen taxpayer, I would want a new government to stop just talking about the ways and resources around defence. You know, a bit more dip, a bit less dip. Open the SDR, don't open the SDR. And we need to talk about the outcomes that we've got to get to. And if the outcome is that we, the UK, as part of NATO, must be prepared to deter Russia from thinking it could attack European NATO at some point, and let's say it's around 2030 because it's linked to an outcome in Ukraine. So if we've got 3 or 4 years to be part of NATO credibly deterring Russia, which I think is pretty much what the Prime Minister has said. If you work back from that outcome, then the dip delivers a minimum outcome 5 years later than that. So there's nothing wrong with the direction of travel. It's the pace and the volume that would have to step up. And that's going to include the stuff that's in the dip but a bit shaky, so you have more of that, and then the stuff we'd have to look at that's not in the dip. And all of this is a very unfortunate and difficult discussion about how we didn't ask for it, very unpalatable. It's going to cause us to take money out of things that we like, but this is the world we live in. And if a new government fails to accept that imperative, it's going to be confronting in 3 years' time potential strategic failure, a failure of deterrence, potential operational failure, which is you put forces in the field as part of NATO and they lose, and you're going to be confronting a moral failure because you'll be sending today's armed forces, who are all somebody's children, into the field in 3 years' time, knowing that you decided not to prepare them properly, and as a result of that, more get killed and wounded than was necessary. And that, I think, is an underrated thought.
You both.
I draw the attention of members of the committee to an article in last Sunday's Observer by Sir Bernard Grey, who used to be the head of procurement in the Ministry of Defence, and at one point away in distant history was my special advisor as well. But a well-informed and somewhat worrying article, which I hope any new Prime Minister would read and take on board.
Thank you. Thank you much. Right, on to Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. We mentioned just before about how some countries do better than us at informing citizens about the need to be resilient. And the committee was recently in Norway a couple of weeks ago. So they do that much better in Norway, and they actually mandate that everyone has to have 7 days supply at home. So much similar to what you're saying, Lord Robertson, but mandated. And they reckon they have, I can't remember what the uptake, they reckon they have maybe sort of 50, 60%, less in cities, more rurally, for kind of obvious reasons. One of the other things they do in Norway is pass a budget through Parliament for defence. And obviously when we travel as a committee amongst our allies, thinking about when you go to America, France, etc., they pass budgets through Parliament or Congress or National Assembly. And it makes an enormous difference because it's cross-party support. It is a demand signal for industry. It takes the kind of decision-making pressure slightly away from the department, the government department. And also, in terms of that conversation on informing the public, it forces people's representatives to be debating publicly defence spending. Whereas in our Parliament, we do it on this committee, and anyone outside of this committee does it by choice, normally because of having a constituency relevant interest in a particular part of the supply chain or what have you. So a question for yourself, Lord Robertson, do you think we should do that in the UK?
Yes, I think we should have a broader debate on a constant basis about defence, and that is the only way, in a way that you will actually get a focus. You know, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Labour MPs at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, and pointed out that the dip was coming. At that point, it had not been published, but that it was going to mean that domestic departments were going to basically be reduced in order to pay for the Defence Investment Plan. And they better be ready for that. There was a huge row the first time round when the government used the development money, you know, in order to boost the defence at that point. And I think people need to know what the trade-offs actually are. So that the Norwegian, Swedish and Finland model is a good one in terms of involving the whole of public to get involved in it. Germany is going through that debate at the present moment. You know, they've abandoned their very strict limitations on borrowing in order to borrow more now in order to increase defence expenditure, and therefore there is a live debate at that point going on. But unless there's a live debate, then those who are making the allocations and doing the trade-offs will be oblivious to the dangers and risks.
So I guess, I agree with that. I'm wondering if you would support a very radical change in the UK of how we come up with decisions around defence spending to have a budget that's passed through Parliament each year. And obviously that would be hugely different. I mean, even this defence investment plan we've had in the last couple of weeks, there is very little detail in it. Much less detail than you'd have to put in something for it to pass through Parliament. So, you know, you compare it to the Americans and the French, how they do it. There's much more detail in those documents. And we have a culture in the UK, I think, of the MOD being very close-hold with information, not just in terms of classification, just in general. Much more circumspect about sharing decision-making processes, partly for reasons of reputation protection, partly for classification. But we are, in my view, in the past 2 years of being an MP, a massive outlier in our allies in that respect. I'm wondering if you would support, in theory, a change like that.
I would certainly be in favour of a greater degree of transparency and a wider debate taking place. You've got to keep some things relatively secret. If you take the 20% of the budget, maybe rising to 25% of the budget on the nuclear enterprise.
Just because we have time. America do it. They don't have a problem with classification in the Pentagon. They still put a budget through Congress. The French put a budget through National Assembly. They don't have a problem with classifications. I think the classification thing we sometimes is more of a cultural thing in the UK, in my view.
Yeah, we are far, in my view, my personal view, we are far too secretive about things that don't require it. You know, practically all the documentation we had was official sensitive. You know, so the moment that it falls into somebody's hands, it becomes a newspaper story. Whereas it can be, this is Tuesday, official sensitive. Well, what the hell is this? So I think there is undoubtedly a culture that is there. If you take the defence nuclear enterprise, I have been arguing for a very lengthy period of time that there needs to be a greater degree of supervision of that budget. It takes up 20% of the whole defence budget. It's huge and it's big, but it's very, very confidential, inevitably, about that. And it is only now that the government as a whole has decided that there will be a specific committee that will be set up to look at it.
And we await further details on it.
Yeah.
General, if I could ask you a different question entirely about the SDR and Defence Investment Plan and taking them as one, putting them together, your views on priorities. And I asked the previous Defence Secretary this same question. So there's 62 recommendations in the SDR, and then we've seen the DIP and we've all looked at that really recently, so it's fresh in our minds. I'm going to ask you what you think the most important thing is in there. I'm also going to ask you what you think the least important thing is in there. And I know that you might want to respond, well, that's the wrong way of saying, wrong question, and we should be asking different questions. That is the question I'm asking. And you said several times that you're not a politician, so we're going to get a non-politician answer from you.
So that's a very difficult question to answer, because it implies that within the current state of UK defence there's much left to give. And the honest truth is that the current state of defence reflects that journey through the post-Cold War era, which means that everything that could have gone has gone. And in many cases, it's held together by sellotape and goodwill. And so when you ask the question, what would you give up? Well, set aside the nuclear deterrent, and that's 25% of the budget. And we've made 3 big commitments: the Atlantic Bastion, the Strategic Reserve Corps, and the contribution to NATO's Air and Space Command. And we are not planning to make those contributions as viable as the alliance need them to be in time. In that, we'll get there in 10 years. We should be there in 5. I think trying to solve this problem by trying to skin things out is exhausted, and it was exhausted in that debate that ran from August last year until the dip came out. We've done that now. The second thing, which is currently sterile, is trying to find more public money. And it's not that from £1.4 trillion this year there isn't enough money in the public sector. It's just that in the way our politics works, nobody is willing to make those hard choices to rebalance from something, I would say welfare, into defence. So that's why we have found half the money that was needed to find the 28 billion in the dip. The conversation, which I think is much more productive but is a struggle to get going, is if you've exhausted the public sector and you can't cut anything else, now you have to engage the private sector. And there is some resistance to this, philosophically perhaps, but if you ask the city to find £50 billion over the next 4 years for things like infrastructure and logistics, they're ready to go. And they're ready to go not in a repeat of the old PFI bad outcomes for the taxpayer carrier. They're ready to go with new commercial vehicles, new ways of working, and they need some new rules with the Treasury. Our rules are the most restrictive in Europe. So I think the better answer to this question about how do we go faster sooner, right now, and I mean before recess, is for the government, this new government, to engage with the city in the way governments have done for 2,000 years when they need to pay for their wars.
Right, thank you much. Lord Robertson, a lot has been made by the government about